Rain tapped softly against the cafe window as Daniel Carter sat frozen in his chair, fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped white mug he hadn't even tasted yet, wondering for the 10th time why he'd agreed to this blind date in the first place, because blind dates were for people with hope, and hope was something he'd buried long ago along with his wife, 2 years earlier, beneath the weight of hospital bills, sleepless nights, and the tiny shoes of a daughter who still waited by the door. Every evening asking when Mama would come home. Daniel was 36, a janitor at a public school by night, a delivery driver by day, and a father every second in between, and tonight was supposed to be harmless, just coffee, just conversation, just a favor to his sister who swore he deserved something good. But the moment the woman across from him lifted her head, eyes red, mascara streaked, silently crying into a folded napkin, Daniel felt something shift in his chest, because this wasn't awkward anymore, it was painful, and he didn't know how to handle pain that wasn't his own. She introduced herself as Evelyn Hart, voice trembling yet controlled, posture straight despite the tears, wearing a simple navy coat that somehow screamed elegance even while she looked completely broken, and Daniel, in his worn jacket and scuffed boots, felt instantly out of place, apologizing softly as if her tears were somehow his fault. But Evelyn shook her head and whispered, "I'm sorry. I just didn't expect to feel this lonely sitting across from a stranger," and something about that sentence cracked open the quiet space between them, because loneliness recognizes loneliness, and Daniel understood her without needing details. He told her, carefully, about being a single father, about Lily, about the nights he read the same bedtime story 3 times because she begged him not to leave the room, and for the first time since his wife passed, he felt seen as Evelyn listened without interruption. Nodding slowly, eyes never leaving his, and then she laughed softly through her tears and said, "You're stronger than you know," words that felt foreign to him, because no one ever told the janitor he was strong, no one ever told the exhausted father he was enough. Time passed unnoticed, rain turned to silence, and the cafe lights dimmed, but something heavy still lingered behind Evelyn's eyes, and when Daniel finally asked what had made her cry, she hesitated, took a deep breath, and said she was tired of being loved for what she owned instead of who she was, tired of boardrooms full of men who listened only when she raised her voice, tired of going home to a penthouse that echoed with emptiness. And Daniel blinked, confused, because nothing about this woman matched the quiet sadness she carried, and that's when she said it casually, almost as if it meant nothing, "I'm the CEO of Hartwell Industries," a name Daniel recognized instantly, a global company whose logo he'd cleaned off school walls during night shifts, and his heart dropped, not because she was rich, but because suddenly the invisible wall between them felt too tall to climb. Embarrassment flooded him, and he apologized again, this time for wasting her time, for pretending he belonged at the same table. But Evelyn reached across and stopped him, her hand warm, firm, human, and said, "Please don't do that." And for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to believe maybe differences didn't matter, maybe this night was about 2 broken people sharing warmth. But then her phone buzzed, lighting up with messages from her assistant, board members, lawyers, reminders of the world she lived in, and the fragile bubble they'd built began to crack. As they stood to leave, she walked him to the door, rain-soaked city lights reflecting in her eyes, and just before stepping away, Evelyn leaned in close, her voice barely louder than the rain, and whispered something that made Daniel's chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since the day he signed the hospital papers, something that shattered the illusion of possibility and planted the seed of heartbreak. And as you listen to this story unfold, remember that every subscription helps bring more real, emotional stories like this to life, stories about invisible people, quiet strength, and love that arrives when we least expect it, because what Evelyn whispered would change everything. Daniel didn't sleep that night, not because of exhaustion, he was used to that, but because Evelyn's whisper replayed in his mind like a wound that refused to close, her words soft yet devastating. "I can't let myself fall for someone I could destroy without meaning to," and the truth in that sentence hurt more than rejection ever could, because it wasn't about lack of feeling, it was about fear, and fear dressed as protection cuts the deepest. Days passed, then weeks, and Daniel returned to his routine, to school hallways, delivery routes, bedtime stories, telling himself that night was just a strange chapter, a momentary intersection between 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. But fate has a cruel sense of humor, because life didn't let him forget Evelyn so easily. Hartwell Industries announced a charity partnership with the school where Daniel worked, and suddenly her name was everywhere, banners, emails, meetings, and when Daniel saw her walk into the gymnasium in a tailored suit, confident, powerful, applauded by teachers and donors, his heart sank, because this Evelyn wasn't the woman who cried into a napkin, and he felt small again, invisible again, until their eyes met across the room, and just for a second, the CEO mask slipped, replaced by the same sadness he recognized, and later that evening, she found him alone stacking chairs, sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow, and apologized for disappearing, confessing that she'd never stopped thinking about him, about Lily, about a life where conversations mattered more than contracts. They talked quietly, honestly, and she admitted she'd grown up poor too, that success was her armor, that power kept people at a distance, and Daniel listened, torn between wanting to believe and wanting to protect his daughter from another goodbye, because heartbreak doesn't just hurt adults, it echoes in children. When Lily later met Evelyn by accident, clutching her stuffed rabbit and asking innocent questions, something inside Evelyn broke completely, because she saw a life she could never buy, and when she left that day, she cried again, alone in her car, realizing money couldn't bridge every gap. Months later, Daniel received a letter, not a text, not a call, a handwritten apology explaining that Evelyn had stepped down temporarily, that she was learning who she was without a title, that she hoped one day he'd forgive her for choosing fear over possibility, and Daniel folded the letter carefully, placing it inside Lily's storybook, understanding that some people come into our lives not to stay, but to remind us of our worth. Years passed, Lily grew, Daniel healed, and one quiet afternoon in a small bookstore far from boardrooms and blind dates, a familiar voice said his name, and when he turned, there was Evelyn, no suit, no entourage, just a woman who had finally learned how to stand without armor, and this time, when she spoke, there was no whisper, no fear, only honesty. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of love, loss, or the courage it takes to choose vulnerability, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're mirrors, and sometimes, we see ourselves in them when we need it most. Daniel stood there in the narrow aisle between shelves stacked with second-hand novels and children's picture books, the smell of old paper and dust wrapping around him as if the universe itself had paused to witness the moment, because Evelyn Hart was standing in front of him not as the untouchable CEO he once believed she was, but as a woman stripped of titles, power, and protection, her hair loosely tied, her eyes calmer yet deeper, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had finally faced herself, and for several seconds neither of them spoke, because some silences are too full to interrupt. Lily was nearby, crouched on the floor flipping through a book, humming softly, unaware that the fragile line between past pain and future possibility was being redrawn right above her head. And when Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice steady but vulnerable, she said she had walked away from everything that once defined her because she realized success without connection was just another kind of poverty, that she had spent years climbing higher only to discover she was standing alone at the top, terrified of falling and equally terrified of letting anyone climb with her. Daniel listened, his heart cautious now, wiser, scarred. Because love had already taught him once that even the strongest bonds could vanish overnight, and he told her the truth, that he didn't hate her for leaving, but he had learned to protect his peace, to choose stability over sparks, to build a life where his daughter never had to watch someone walk away again. And Evelyn nodded, tears pooling but not falling, accepting that accountability doesn't demand forgiveness, it only hopes for understanding. Weeks passed after that meeting, slow and intentional, coffee instead of candlelight, park benches instead of penthouses, conversations that didn't promise forever but honored the present, and Evelyn showed up, not with gifts or gestures, but with consistency, learning Lily's routines, listening to Daniel's worries about rent and school fees without trying to fix everything with money, because she finally understood that love isn't rescue, it's partnership. Time did not heal everything, but it softened the sharpest edges, and Daniel learned that healing was less about forgetting pain and more about learning how to carry it without letting it crush you. And as seasons changed, so did the rhythm of his life, shaped by Lily's laughter, school mornings, packed lunches, and quiet nights where he finally allowed himself to breathe. Evelyn did not rush back into his world after that bookstore meeting, because she had learned painfully that love cannot be forced into timelines or repaired with apologies alone, and instead she rebuilt herself slowly, volunteering anonymously, renting a small apartment, learning how to live without assistants, drivers, or the constant hum of power, discovering that silence could be peaceful rather than empty when it was shared honestly. Months later, when Daniel agreed to meet her again, it was not because he was certain, but because certainty had never been a guarantee of safety anyway, and this time their conversations were different, no grand promises, no dreams built too high too fast, just truth, vulnerability, and the courage to admit fear without letting it decide everything. Lily, intuitive beyond her years, watched closely, testing Evelyn not with words but with trust, and when Evelyn showed up to school events, helped with homework, listened more than she spoke, Daniel felt something unfamiliar bloom, not excitement, but steadiness, the quiet reassurance that maybe this time love wasn't a storm. Maybe it was shelter, yet the past does not disappear simply because the present is kinder, and one evening Daniel confessed his deepest fear, that one day Evelyn would wake up and realize this small life was not enough, that the world she once ruled would call her back, and Lily would once again learn how to say goodbye. And Evelyn did not interrupt, did not defend herself, she simply listened, tears forming not from guilt but understanding, and she answered not with promises but with choice. telling him that every day she stayed would be a decision, not an obligation, because real love isn't proven once, it's proven repeatedly. The moment that finally changed everything came quietly, without drama, on an ordinary night when Lily fell asleep between them on the couch, her head resting against Evelyn's shoulder, and Daniel saw in Evelyn's eyes not fear, not doubt, but peace, and he understood then that heartbreak had not been punishment, it had been preparation, shaping them into people capable of loving without possession, without fear, without escape. Years later,